The editor never looked up from his screen. That was what Ruth Walker noticed first. She stood just inside the doorway of the editorial office, a stack of marked-up pages held neatly against her chest, waiting for some sign that she'd been seen. The office smelled like toner and old books, the kind of place where words were treated with respect, as long as they came from the right people. Ruth was black, 39, and officially listed as a typing assistant. She retyped legal manuscripts, corrected formatting, standardized citations. Her name never appeared on covers. Her work lived in the margins and footnotes, invisible by design. She had been doing this for 11 years. "Leave it there," the editor said without looking up. "I'll get to it." Ruth stepped forward and placed the pages on the corner of his desk, but she didn't let go. "There's an issue in Chapter 6, she said calmly, "in the footnotes." That finally made him glance up, not with irritation, with mild surprise, like a lamp flickering where he didn't expect one. "The footnotes?" he repeated. "Yes," Ruth said. "They reference precedent that doesn't apply anymore. The statute was amended in 1998. Quietly, most people miss it." The editor smiled the way professionals did when they were about to dismiss someone politely. "Ruth," he said, softening his tone, "your job is to type what's written. The legal analysis has already been reviewed." She nodded. "It's still wrong." He chuckled, not unkindly. "You're very thorough, but this book is being cited in appellate briefs. The author is a sitting professor." Ruth didn't argue with the title. She opened her folder and slid out a single page, one she'd printed herself. "This footnote cites Harris v. Coleman," she said, "but that ruling was limited by State v. Jenkins. The limitation isn't obvious unless you read the legislative history." The editor leaned back now, arms crossed. "And you read legislative history?" he asked, amused. "I type it," Ruth replied, "for hours. You remember things when you type them enough times." He waved a hand gently. "I appreciate the initiative, but that's outside your scope." Outside your scope. Ruth heard that phrase often. She gathered her papers and turned to leave. But as she reached the door, she paused. "If this goes to print as is," she said without turning around, "courts will keep applying a rule the law already abandoned, and people will keep losing cases they shouldn't." Silence stretched behind her. Then the editor cleared his throat. "I'll take a look," he said. Ruth didn't respond. She walked back to her desk, sat down, and returned to typing. Because she already knew what would happen next. He would skim, he would assume, he would move on. He always did. What the editor didn't know, what no one in that office knew, was that Ruth Walker had once been a law student herself. That she'd left school not for lack of ability, but for lack of money when her father got sick. That she had spent years inside the law anyway, one keystroke at a time, watching how arguments were built and where they quietly failed. She didn't need a title to understand the consequences, and she didn't need permission to notice them. They ignored the typist because they believed authority lived in authorship, not attention. They didn't realize yet that the smallest notes, buried at the bottom of the page, were about to travel further than any headline. And that when the law finally changed, it would be because someone everyone overlooked refused to stop reading the fine print. The first sign that something had shifted came 3 weeks later. Ruth noticed it, not because anyone told her, but because a familiar manuscript came back to her desk marked Revised, Urgent. That almost never happened at this stage. Books didn't come back once the editor had waved them through. They moved forward on momentum alone. She scrolled to Chapter 6. The footnotes were different. Not fixed, not corrected, but circled, highlighted, commented on. The editor had written a single note in the margin. "Can you verify this?" Ruth stared at the screen for a long moment, fingers hovering above the keyboard. Then she answered. She didn't write a paragraph. She didn't lecture. She cited 3 cases, 2 legislative committee notes, and 1 obscure amendment buried in a budget reconciliation bill that had never made headlines. She attached copies, She dated everything, and she sent it back. An hour later, the editor appeared at her desk. That alone was unusual. He stood there holding a printout of her response, reading it again as if the words might rearrange themselves. "How long have you known this?" he asked. Ruth kept typing. "Since I typed it the first time," she said. 5 years ago." He blinked. "Why didn't you say something then?" Ruth looked up at him. "I did." The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was uncomfortable. That afternoon, the editor cancelled 2 meetings. He reread the chapter himself, this time not skimming, but tracing the citations the way Ruth always had. He realized the problem wasn't isolated. It spread outward, touching interpretations other authors had borrowed, assumptions that had calcified simply because no one revisited them. Precedent built on precedent. Error stacked quietly. By the end of the day, he called the author. The call didn't go well. The professor bristled, deflected, argued that courts had been applying the rule for decades, that changing the footnote would undermine confidence in the work. "But the law changed," the editor said, "and we missed it." There was a pause on the line. "Who caught this?" the professor asked. The editor hesitated. "A staff member," he said. He didn't say her name, not yet. The revision delayed publication by 6 weeks. That alone caused ripples. Advanced citations had to be withdrawn. A few law firms called asking why the release date had moved. The editor gave vague answers about final review. Inside the office, Ruth kept typing, but something had changed in how people looked at her. Questions started appearing on her desk. Quiet ones, careful ones. "Hey, Ruth, does this citation look right to you? Have you seen this statute before? Can you check something for me real quick?" She answered all of them, not eagerly, not triumphantly, precisely. Then the call came from outside the building, a clerk from the state appellate court. He spoke quickly, like someone who didn't want to be overheard. "Are you the one who reviewed the Walker and Harris manuscript?" he asked. Ruth paused. "I typed it," she said. "Well," he replied, "we just had a brief pulled because of a footnote change. It disrupted an argument that's been standard for years." Ruth closed her eyes briefly. "That footnote is correct," she said. "I know," the clerk replied. "That's the problem." 2 weeks later, a judge cited the revised footnote in a concurring opinion. Not the main ruling, just a note. But legal scholars noticed. Blog posts appeared. Law reviews questioned long-held assumptions. Defense attorneys filed motions citing the amendment Ruth had flagged, all because one footnote changed. The editor watched the reaction with something close to disbelief. "What have we done?" he asked Ruth one evening, half joking. She didn't smile. "We corrected the record," she said. "The law does the rest." They had ignored the typist because they believed her job ended where the margins began. They were learning, slowly, uncomfortably, that the margins were where the truth had been hiding all along. And now that it was visible, the law was starting to bend around it. The pushback came fast, too fast to be coincidence. Within days of the concurring opinion, senior partners at major firms started calling the publisher, not angrily, never angrily, with concern, with questions framed as professionalism. Is this interpretation settled? Are you sure this amendment was meant to have such reach? We're worried about confusion. Confusion was the word they used when certainty stopped serving them. The editor called Ruth into his office for the first time since she'd worked there. He closed the door. "That footnote is causing ripples," he said, choosing the word carefully. Ruth sat straight-backed in the chair across from him. "It's supposed to." He rubbed his temples. "Some very serious people are saying we've overcorrected." Ruth nodded. "They would." He looked up sharply. "Why?" "Because the old interpretation was convenient," she said. "It shifted burdens quietly. This puts them back where the statute intended." The editor leaned back, studying her. Not like an assistant now, but like a colleague he was only just realizing he'd had all along. "You're certain?" he said. Ruth didn't hesitate. "Yes," he exhaled. "Then we stand by it." That decision cost the publisher 2 authors and 1 lucrative annual contract. It also earned them something rarer: credibility. At the law school across town, a junior professor assigned the revised chapter as supplemental reading. She asked her students to trace the change backward to see how one assumption had echoed for years without ever being rechecked. They found Ruth's footnote. Someone wrote about it on a legal blog, naming it the Walker correction. Another scholar pushed back publicly, calling it an overreading by editorial staff. Ruth read the critique during her lunch break, sandwich untouched. She didn't respond. She pulled the statute, the amendment, the committee notes, and the cases that followed. She laid them out the way she always had, chronologically, without commentary. The answer remained the same. What changed was who was willing to say it out loud. A public defender's office filed a motion citing the amended interpretation directly. The judge granted a hearing. Then another office did the same. Then another. Within 3 months, appellate courts in 2 states issued opinions explicitly rejecting the old reading and adopting the corrected one. Each opinion referenced the same legislative history, the same quiet amendment. None of them mentioned Ruth, but they didn't need to. The editor finally did. At an internal meeting with the board, someone asked who had caught the error in the first place. The editor paused longer than usual. "Our typist," he said. "Ruth Walker." There was a murmur, a few raised eyebrows. "Typist?" someone repeated. "Yes," he said firmly, "and the most careful legal reader in this building." That line made it into the minutes. The next week, Ruth's job title changed, not dramatically, not ceremoniously. From typing assistant to editorial research specialist, she noticed the difference not in the words, but in the access. Drafts came to her earlier. Questions were asked instead of brushed aside. When she flagged issues now, people listened the first time. Still, the law moved slower than pride. At a legal conference that summer, a panel debated the recent reinterpretation trend. One speaker dismissed it as editorial activism, another defended it as overdue correction. In the audience, Ruth sat quietly, notebook in hand. She wrote down who argued from authority and who argued from text. They had ignored the typist because they believed expertise announced itself loudly, with titles, with credentials, with the confidence of having already been believed. They were learning that expertise sometimes arrives quietly, lives in footnotes, and waits patiently until the consequences of ignoring it become too large to contain. The law was changing now, not because someone wanted it to, but because someone had finally read what it actually said. The ruling came down on a Friday afternoon, quietly posted to the court's website between unrelated opinions and procedural orders. It didn't announce itself as historic. It didn't need to. The state Supreme Court cited the amended statute directly, cleanly, confidently, and rejected the decades-old interpretation in a unanimous decision. The opinion traced the legislative history carefully, almost patiently, as if teaching the law to remember itself. In a footnote near the end, the court wrote, "Prior reliance on pre-1998 language is misplaced. That single sentence unraveled hundreds of cases. Public defenders celebrated cautiously. Civil rights groups reread filings with new eyes. Prosecutors recalculated strategies they had assumed were settled forever. Law schools updated syllabi mid-semester. Commentators called it a correction, then a shift, then, once they accepted it, a reorientation." The editor read the decision twice, then walked to Ruth's desk. "It's done," he said. Ruth looked up from her keyboard. "Good," she replied, and went back to typing. The real impact didn't come all at once. It came case by case, a sentence reduced here, a conviction overturned there, a civil judgment re-examined because the burden of proof had been quietly misplaced for years. People who had lost under the old reading began to win, not because the law had changed, but because it had finally been applied as written. No one called Ruth to thank her. That was fine. She didn't need gratitude. She needed accuracy. Months later, at a publishing industry event, a senior legal editor spoke on a panel about the dangers of complacency in citation. He referenced the case without naming names, talking about how assumptions calcify when no one is assigned to question them. In this instance, he said, the correction came from the lowest rung of the ladder. Ruth, sitting in the back, closed her notebook. Afterward, the editor found her by the coat rack. "I should have credited you sooner," he said quietly. Ruth met his eyes. "You should have listened sooner." He nodded. "You're right." The publisher created a new internal rule that year. All footnotes would receive independent review, separate from main text analysis. It slowed production. It saved credibility. Other firms copied it. Ruth was offered a position at a law firm, research only, no bar required. She declined. Then another offer came, and another. She declined those too. She liked where she was. One evening, long after the office emptied, Ruth stayed late, finishing a manuscript that would shape how courts understood administrative power. She caught a minor inconsistency in a footnote. Small, technical, easy to ignore. She corrected it. Somewhere down the line, that correction would matter. Not because it was loud, but because it was right. They had ignored the typist because they believed the law lived in arguments, not in margins. Because they trusted voices that sounded certain more than hands that were careful. Her footnotes changed the law not by challenging authority head-on, but by refusing to let error hide where no one thought to look. And when the legal system finally adjusted, it did so the way it always had when truth could no longer be avoided, quietly, reluctantly, and all at once.